right? So then we could say, then you'd say the yang principle is the most important. But if there wasn't an equal balance with the yin principle and an equal validity of night and day, then you'd look at places that, like the Sahara Desert, and you'd say that very few, it can't really, the human it has trouble, there are very few people surviving in the Sahara Desert. And so if there wasn't other places on the world that you could survive, the human population wouldn't expand to the point it is. It needed that constant balance between night and day to be able to set an environment up that could then be survived in with for us. But so the fact is that the Earth spins and the sun only hits each part of the country for certain amounts of time is what is really. So if you would look at it, and everyone says the sun is most important because without the sun but without the Earth turning and the sun going away, we wouldn't survive either. And so really, if we just look at the planet and say, the way we've got to here is because of those two qualities. And those two qualities, and then because the planet is tilted and as the Earth spins and moves around the sun, it shifts the relationship to the sun to the planet shifts between the equinox, between the north and south. What do they call them? Not the
Poles?
Those two lines. What?
North and South poles?
No, because the sun only moves between the north, that meridian north, and the meridian south. It only
Hemispheres?
moves. No.
Hmm.
You have the equator, and then you have the distance the sun goes north, and that's a line, and it reaches a certain line. And then the distance the sun goes south, and that's another line. It's the
Prime meridian?
oh man, no.
Hmm.
You can come across them when you're driving. You go down and you come across them, and there's one in the northern hemisphere and one in the southern hemisphere. I'll think of it in a moment. Anyway, these two places, because the sun doesn't go all the way to the pole. It never gets to the pole. It stops in relationship to the Earth and just moves between these two. One of them goes the longitudes and latitude. Between these two latitudes.
Hmm.
So the equator is at 0, and then you have one which is so many degrees to the south and one that's so many degrees to the north. And you have these two latitude lines, long latitude lines that determine how far the sun goes, and therefore keep majority of the world in a temperate sort of place. And that's why the poles are much colder, because they don't get as much sun. And but the poles are cold, which stores water for the world and freezes the water, and that's being seen. So you can see how that the yin and yang is working in the fact that the equator is hot, and as you move north or south, it gets cooler and cooler until you get to the poles, which are cold, and they hold this huge amount of water that is now in the process of being flooded down here, because it's being the heat is getting hotter, and so the question really then resides is the balance what is important, the acceptance of both as valid, or do we just say that the yang principle is more important, which is what this world is run on at the moment, and you can extrapolate that out into governments, wars, the yang principle, when people don't like something, they fight because they're the people who are determining this are generally men, and the men, except it's changing here, but the men are generally of the Yang principle. And so, is it the fact that we ditch the balance and start saying we can create something better because we are like God? And therefore, we can create something better by designing it ourselves because we believe that doing is better than not doing. And the more I do, the more money I have. Even in the what this country is moving towards is everyone wants to be wealthy so they can have a wealthy life, which means sleeping becomes, well, I can't party when I'm sleeping, or I can't work when I'm sleeping, or I can't have a good time when I'm sleeping, blah, blah, blah. And so therefore we start to create a life that, how do we do that to be able to not to sleep? And then you look at the result of that as we have it at the moment and say, is that the result we really want? Is the human really satisfied? And there's a lot of dissatisfaction. So is the human really satisfied to have doing all the time, to be doing all the time? And yeah.
So is this? Are we satisfied with always doing? I mean, I. It seems like we can't really fight our biology to some degree. I mean, like we we have these ideas and create these systems, and we are executing them, but we at least in human driven systems so far, I mean, people still have to sleep at some point. They need a break, they need a vacation. um,
No, vacation's not sleeping. Because people don't sleep on vacations unless they go camping. They do stuff.
right. Yeah, it's all activity, more activities, just exciting, more fun activities, right?
And you just not, you get to choose what you're doing. That's why we think it's terrific, because not being told by a boss or by someone I have to do this, or you spend a week not worrying about money and you've saved up for it and you go and do something super exciting, because there are not many people that take vacations just to sleep for a week, right?
Right. Right, they go out, they have a destination in mind and activities. It's
They want to travel somewhere, they want to go to an exciting place, they want to do something, they want to, I mean, sort of not exciting for me when you want to go and look at museums and look at architecture or whatever people do. They want to go to a beach and they want to party at night and eat great food and do all these things, right? That require them to work harder, right?
so what I'm kind of curious about now is like, what is the solution to is it to do something about the imbalance? Like, do we do something, or is observing? I mean, obviously, we're mostly making observations right now, and
That
trying to
so that
discern what it really is, what's really happening.
to
But
do something about the imbalance, that requires more doing. So if we first would have to, in our side of ourselves, and this is the course that my friend and I are trying to do, is actually people acknowledge the balance, or that a friend of mine said, it's not that one is better than the other or that they're equal, it's the ability to have them, to be able to move between them. So now you look at the way the world works, and winter and summer is a movement between the yin principle and the yang principle. So it moves from one being dominant to the point of the highest sun and the hottest day and the longest day and the longest light. Actually, for plants, I think it's light. And then move to the shortest day and the least amount of light.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this movement throughout the year. Every day we change, so that there's this constant movement between one and the other. And when one starts to get more dominant, then the other one will suddenly become like the ice age and things like that. When something sets off something else will happen to keep the balance.
Sure.
But if we say, so to do something about it is just more yang principle. So on some level we have to do less about it. And in my world, the thing that if I could, I read a book by a guy who was able to help various groups. Like I think his one project he started on was removing Milosevic from government in Serbia. And the classic story that he writes is that, they couldn't confront the regime straight up with people because they just get, removed. So the word chicken, apparently the word chicken is, if you call someone a chicken, especially a female, it's like a big insult. And so what they did is Milosevic's wife loved wearing these flour in her hair. And so what they did is they got a hold of the chickens and they made imitations of these flowers and they put them on all the chickens and let them loose in the city. And so it was clearly what they were saying was Milosevic's wife is a chicken. And the hilarity of watching the police try and catch these chickens, because they couldn't let them go, but there's no one, they couldn't arrest anyone. And so there was this whole different attitude to protest, where it wasn't going out in the streets and yelling and screaming, it was using humor, which is sort of a softer way of doing it. And so if I could, and so he helps people, he had a hand in helping the people for the Arab Spring work out ways non-violent ways of opposing things. So non-violence compared to violence, yang and yin.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it would be actually doing less. So instead of doing something about it, you are doing something, but in the process you're doing less. Is don't turn your lights on at night. Imagine if you had a whole city not turn their lights on at night. And actually the COVID had a big effect on this, because people used their cars less, people did less. And other than the fear of COVID, if you look what happens, you see people walking up and down the streets much more with their families and things like that. And so in some way, COVID brought about the yin principle, a much stronger, less doing, less. I mean, it's very worrying for people, because a lot of people who live on their paychecks week to week, but for the people who have jobs and didn't have to go to the office and who kept the middle class and the upper middle class who had lots of money, it was a very relaxing time. But so to me, it's a matter of working out. It's like when people go camping. You talk to them about camping, and they go to bed when it's dark, and they get up with it's light, and they come back, and everyone goes out. They go out hiking and camping, but what they always say, yeah, we hiked here and we did that, we did this, but if you really question them, you'll find that was very relaxing, and because they went to bed when it was dark, or they sat around a campfire, or things like that. And so it's really about, in my world, is acknowledging. The first thing you have to do is acknowledge that night is as important as day, which is really difficult thing for people to do. It's really, because that then says dying is important as living. And I don't think it ever gets to that point, but that's where people, and that if I'm not doing, I'm not living. So even watching television is doing. But to stop and do nothing, it's real, other than going to sleep, just to do nothing regularly is a difficult thing. But on some level, I think the human being would be way more satisfied if that was possible. Constant complaint I hear is that I have too much to do.
Mm.
But you think about in politics, for instance, imagine if yin and yang were both valid. That would mean Donald Trump and Joe Biden were both valid, are the same.
Impossible.
What? Right. You say that can't be true, because but on the other side of it, if you look at just under half of the country say the opposite to what you say. So when we have right or wrong as the only option, then we can never really solve problems. We can never, when night and day aren't equal, we can't ever really solve problems, because depending on the way the country's set up, prospectively, probably half of the country, that two halves of the country are always against each other.
Right, and it's totally unproductive, right?
Totally.
They just outright oppose anything that the other side comes up with.
Totally. And it's becoming stronger. The imbalance is becoming stronger. And the rich and the poor, that's another one. That imbalance is getting way out of line. And that's a yin and yang. That's a yang and yin principle. The yang principle of having more, and the yin principle of less. And it's totally. And so there is absolutely no way that we can solve any of the problems in the world with wrong and right, because you're wrong and my right. Well, no, when you say wrong and right, and I say wrong and right, or people who voted for Trump say wrong and right, they're all different. And so all you're doing is ever finding a majority, which could be 51 and 49, and so half of your population totally is. And then you start, as we get on, and you have people who really want the Yang principle to be going, is that the Republican Party is the Yang principle, because they want to be always doing business and wealthy and da-da-da-da, and the Yin principle of the Democrats, which say, but we want to look after people and look after the poor and make sure, and we align ourselves. It's like a football match, and only winning is the most important thing. What happens if you said, okay, and we say we want more parties, but they're still aligned one way or the other. And if you had the two parties and you gave them 100 senators each, or 100 in the House each, and said you get to vote for that 100, and you get to vote for that 100, and then you have to have a 90% majority to make anything work.
That would never. I mean, hopefully at some point. Well, yeah, and I have ideas about I guess like ranked choice voting is one thing to get around that. There's ideas about getting the population more involved in bills specifically, rather than just voting on representatives. But I mean, the point there being, I mean, yeah, to pin the two sides against each other is basically inviting the stalemate
or war. War is the other way around it. We pretty much have war in this country now in the political system.
Yeah.
And in most other countries, if this was happening, then someone would, like Trump would say, I'm not going, and he would rig the elections and he'd be out. I mean, not that either side wouldn't do this, but we're just saying because Trump, that's what he's been clearly stated. He'd say, I'm good for this country, I'm staying, and what he wants to do now, even though he just got voted out. And so you immediately sideline Trump and say he's wrong because the other guy won. But clearly, Trump had some things going for him that were needed. But Biden supporters could never say that because the whole election was about beating Trump. And that sort of, then we pretty much have in the country, we have all these people who are now who believe that the election was rigged and that they lost. And so what does that mean as far as getting things done? Mitch McConnell's saying that he's not going to let the government do anything because he's got the majority in the House. And so everyone's in it to win any way they can. The fact is that you have to have a lot of money to win an election. It means that only the wealthy or people who are the wealthy want in power are going to get in power. It's just so the Yang principle is dominant. And so that's what we get. But what I'm saying is that people don't recognize the fact that everyone is saying yes to that. The majority of people in this country are saying yes to, the Black Lives Matter. Well, that's just, they want to riot and do things or they want to demonstrate and that, but really in their lives they're saying yes to the Yang principle too. Because if you gave them all lots of money, they'd buy lots of things and have nice holidays, and everyone would do the same. Even, so at the moment, day is so much more important than night. And then we say we need to change this, but we're going to change it in the same way that we put it in place. That doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, it's the Yang system, right? Is in a sense only going to be able to create more Yang.
Right. So everybody who wanted change to happen started turning off. They're not using their lights at night. They'd save on their electricity bill. They'd save on many things, and they slept a lot more. They'd be healthier, stronger, and all these things would come into place. And if the society took that on as a whole, then there would be the relationship between the rich. There'd be less money going to the rich because if people stopped buying things, only bought the necessities. All those people like Microsoft and that would start losing money. So they'd keep more money in their pockets. Maybe it'd be less jobs. But if people started to say that night and day were equal, then you'd find that there'd be less they need. And how would that affect the balance? Women would be totally as valid as men. How would that affect the way we deal with dissension, or not dissension, when we have problems?
Right, like if more women were involved in the high levels of office, high levels of politics.
Yeah, and they were real women. They weren't women being men because they have to be able to survive. If they were allowed to go into office being totally valid let's look at the countries that have women in there as their presidents or prime ministers. Taiwan, New Zealand. There's a whole lot of ones in the Scandinavian countries. And look at how they've dealt with the COVID situation. And all of it, it's like a totally different way of doing it. There's a prime minister in New Zealand who's apparently had a baby in office, I think.
And New Zealand was doing really well with COVID for a long time. I think they had like a pretty good stretch of having no cases.
Taiwan done famously. But you look at our medicine too. Our medicine is very young, and it can't deal with yin. It can't, when there is about, doing things without just heroic medicine and doing it softly, like herbs and things like that works longer term, or sort of more spending, not being, sugar is yang, leading less of the things that cause fire in us, and balancing our food to make the balance that the yin foods are the whole thing against saturated fat was like to doing things with non-foods without fat in them, which is like making them completely young. And less, fasting compared to not eating compared to eating, the balance between not eating. The average American apparently eats 15 times a day.
How many times?
15. That's one statistic. I don't know whether that's true. I might, I haven't researched it hugely, but that doesn't leave a lot of time for not eating. And our temperature that we live in has a very low range, so the warmth is, well, I guess in the summer it's cold, but it's still the same temperature pretty much all year round. 60s, 70s in the winter, and 60s in the summer, something like that. So again, having the right amount of sort of the range. So we say that we only want one. We don't want this big swing from winter to spring and summer. We just want to keep everything close. Maybe that's because we all came from the equator originally. I don't know, where it was a lot more balanced. Might be. But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and the whole Wim Hof process, I guess, comes up with that,
Uh-huh.
and saunas, and
Uh-huh.
just how our bodies really benefit from those extreme exposures. But of course, it's not a chronic exposure, right? It's
Right.
Dwelling there for a short amount of time and then coming back to but then the idea there is that when you go to those extremes, it helps you to be able to deal with a more variable base level. So
right. How many?
You don't
Right.
need as much heat or cooling in your house if you're
right
able to adapt.
How many people could live in the summer in Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia, without air conditioning?
Yeah, not many. I mean, I've been spending the whole pretty much last year in pretty extremely climate controlled house, and I mean, I think my capacity has dropped quite a bit, even just from not actively doing Wim Hof exercises or saunas, and all of a sudden I've noticed I'm just not.
How does that affect our ability to handle COVID.
Well, theoretically, it's I mean, we're crap. I mean, look at us. look,
Yeah,
look at this country.
right,
I mean, it's like we're. I was just seeing today. It's like we're. It's the worst it's been since spring.
right. And as our bodies have to deal with the cold weather, which we just don't like, I mean, or the extremes. I wonder if you could relate it, the upswings and downswings, to do extremes of the weather. As it gets hotter, or whereas the change in seasons is the one place that tends to cause the most. Whenever I find people get sick, it's always in the change of the season
Mm-hmm.
because they don't actually change seasons, but some sort of they don't allow their body to change. I think apparently I read once where there's a switch in the body that if you get cold in the winter, you don't keep yourself warm through the beginning of winter. You let yourself feel the cold and get cold. Your body switches over and is more resilient. But if you just stay warm all the way through, you go from warm summer to warm winter, and you never feel the cold, your body doesn't. I guess it's probably the same with heat too. As soon as you come in and it gets hot, in the spring, the Chinese say, the Taoists say, stay in winter as long as you can. So you feel the cold. You don't suddenly heat yourself up. You don't go out on the first day of sunshine and throw off all your clothes and run around the sun. You keep an eye on the plants that do that. They often get hit by the cold that final cold snap. So there's this sort of balance that you've got to keep in the change of seasons.
So that's with
But
every season. You try to stay with the last season that was. You try to avoid the transition
well,
to.
it's not that you're trying to avoid the transition. You acknowledge the transition and see what it. You have to no. You have to be willing to understand the way the weather works. So you have to in winter, as winter comes on, the tendency is the first time you feel cold because you've come out of summer and the cold's going to feel stronger. That first cold day will feel really cold because you're used to the heat, right?
Right.
And so if you don't feel that cold and just let your body cool down almost through fall, by the time you get to winter, it's the same in winter to summer. If you come out of winter and you feel that first warm day and you act like summer, then it's like you expand too much in the wrong time. Instead of just going out and letting the heat start to slowly come into you, rather than ripping off all your clothes and running around like you would, in summer.
Mm.
If you look at the growth of trees, when you look at a growth ring out of a tree, they'll have two growth seasons. They have spring and they have summer. And in spring, the tree will grow suddenly and rapidly, but the growth ring's not. Osage orange is a classic for this. The density of the growth ring from spring is it's not very strong. And for instance, I met this guy who could take a draw knife when he was making bows, and he could run his draw knife along the spring growth on the Osage to get the one growth ring all the way along. He could run it along the spring growth ring, and he could feel that compared to the summer growth ring, which then the tree settles in and goes for this long growing period.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much harder and much stronger, much more dense. So there's that balance between fast and slow again, and even in the trees, but you've got to work out how to position yourself through those changes that you actually change. You
Well,
know
and
what I mean?
there's also I mean this whole element of diet that we don't experience anymore.
Right.
unless we're actively trying to. But most people just they have the same diet throughout the year.
Right.
So and I
Yeah.
mean, between that and herbs, herbal treatments, and um, I mean, there's also various ceremonies that people would
Well,
participate in to transition but yeah, we don't really have. I mean, I guess we have celebrations. We I guess our own forms of ceremony, but and then there's maybe occasional the pumpkin spice latte. Uh, um, but generally, I mean,
pumpkin
it's
spice latte.
you what? Yeah, you love that shit, right?
Yeah. Pumpkin spice. I don't think I've ever had one, man. It sounds awful.
Oh no, they're great. It's,
Really?
yeah, it's like 90,
Uh,
90% sugar and 10% artificial flavors.
oh, I have. Yeah.
It's what it's what
All
your
right.
body
Well,
needs.
I think it's time that we conclude this heavy speaking because we're both starting to disappear into. Uh, is that enough?
I think so. Any final words before I hit the button?
No, I don't have any. I've said everything on it. That that I it it's a this is a difficult conversation for people. That right and wrong are the same. Night and day are the same. Even though they're different, they are the same. And you position yourself on one side of the argument or the other, and so they're the same. Like, what is it? One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right.
It's like if you position yourself on one side of the argument or the other, and the other side is wrong and you're right, that's that's how everyone lives their lives in this culture. That's all I'd say.